Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. I'm Edward, glad to share another quiet hour of observation and reason with you. Tell me, where are you this evening? Is there a lamp burning nearby, a cup cooling gently at your elbow, the faint sound of the world settling into stillness? These are the hours Watson valued most deeply. Ink on paper, thought unhurried, truth approached with patience rather than haste. Tonight we find ourselves in a snowbound manor far from London, where isolation strips away pretense and leaves only what can truly be observed. As Watson himself came to understand, the gravest errors arise not from what we fail to see, but from what we assume must be true. Do subscribe to Watson's Margin so no detail escapes you, and if you prefer to listen, our Spotify channel awaits. The link is in the description below. Now, draw your chair a little closer. Chapter 1. The Storm at Blackthorne Manor. It is a curious truth, which I have had occasion to observe across many years of companionship with Mr. Sherlock Holmes, that the most singular adventures frequently announce themselves in the most prosaic manner. A folded note upon the breakfast table, a card left with Mrs. Hudson whilst we were abroad, a knock at the door in the small hours. Such modest harbingers have more than once preceded events, which I should scarcely have credited had I not witnessed them with my own eyes. The affair which I now set down for the record was heralded by nothing more remarkable than a telegram, delivered to our rooms in Baker Street on a Thursday afternoon in the latter days of January, during one of the bitterest winters I can recall in a long acquaintance with the English climate. Holmes had been in poor spirits for the better part of a fortnight. There was no case of sufficient complexity to hold his attention, and in its absence he had fallen into those habits of torpid restlessness which I had long since learned to regard with a measure of private anxiety. He lay for hours upon the settee, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his grey eyes fixed upon the ceiling with an expression of supreme dissatisfaction. The violin had been taken up and put down again half a dozen times before noon. The morning newspapers lay in a heap upon the floor, apparently exhausted of whatever trifling interest they had briefly provided. I was engaged in reviewing my notes from a previous case when Mrs. Hudson appeared with the yellow envelope, and I observed that Holmes was upon his feet before the good woman had fully entered the room. He tore the telegram open with a single practised movement, read it twice in rapid succession, and then handed it across to me without comment. The message was brief and urgent in tone. It read as follows: Mr. Holmes, urgent matter of government importance, dossier at risk, travel impossible without your presence. Please come at once to Blackthorne Manor, North Riding. Reply by return. L. Harcourt. You know the name? I asked. Lionel Harcourt, Holmes replied, already moving towards the mantelpiece and his tobacco. A diplomatic courier of some 12 years' standing, reliable, conscientious, not given to dramatic overstatement. If Harcourt describes a matter as urgent, Watson, it will not disappoint. He paused, striking a match. Besides, the word dossier is one I never pass over lightly. Within the hour he had sent his reply, and by the following morning we were aboard the northbound express, our luggage stowed, and our coats drawn tight against a cold which seemed to intensify with every mile we put between ourselves and London. The sky beyond the carriage window was an unbroken expanse of grey, heavy with the particular stillness that precedes heavy snowfall. Holmes sat opposite me for much of the journey, occasionally consulting a railway map, occasionally closing his eyes in what I had learned was not sleep but concentrated thought. I occupied myself with a novel, though I confess I read the same page 3 times without retaining a word of it. We were met at the nearest station by a trap and driver who, from his pinched expression and short replies, seemed to have formed no very favourable opinion of the weather or of the journey ahead. The road to Blackthorne Manor wound for some 4 miles through country of bleak and impressive character, broad moorland broken by dry stone walls, and stands of bare ash and oak that bent in the rising wind like men leaning into argument. The first flakes of snow began to fall before we had covered half the distance. Blackthorne Manor presented itself to us at last through the failing light of late afternoon, as a substantial stone house of the Jacobean period, set upon a slight rise and flanked by outbuildings which had clearly seen better decades. Lights burned in the lower windows, and a thin line of smoke rose from two of the chimneys, but the overall impression was one of isolation so complete as to seem almost deliberate. As we descended from the trap, the snow was falling in earnest now, settling upon the gravel of the approach with that soft, persistent industry which suggests it intends a long stay. Harcourt met us at the door himself, a lean, fair-haired man of 40 or thereabouts, whose habitual composure appeared under considerable strain. He greeted Holmes with evident relief, shook my hand warmly enough, and ushered us inside without ceremony. The entrance hall was generously proportioned but somewhat cold, the heat of the house having evidently retreated into the rooms closer to its fireplaces. "I am grateful you have come, Mr. Holmes," he said, me with the controlled quietness of a man who has learned to conduct important conversations in unremarkable tones. "I would not have sent for you had I felt I had any alternative." "You may set my mind at ease on one point immediately," Holmes replied, handing his coat and hat to the hovering manservant. "The dossier, it is still in your possession?" Harcourt's hesitation, brief as it was, told its own story. "For the moment," he said carefully, "I will explain everything, but first let me introduce you to the company." The sitting room into which he led us contained 5 individuals, arranged about the fire and the lamps with the slightly self-conscious ease of persons who have been in one another's company somewhat longer than they had anticipated. Harcourt made the introductions with the practised efficiency of a man accustomed to diplomatic occasions. Sir Julian Blackthorne was the owner of the house, a stout, florid gentleman of 60, with a sportsman's complexion and a magistrate's bearing, who received us with the cordiality of a host whose hospitality has been placed in an awkward light. Mrs. Evelyn Cartwright, Harcourt's cousin, was a handsome woman of perhaps 35, composed and watchful, who acknowledged our arrival with a polite inclination of her head. Captain Miles Radcliffe, recently retired from the army, his posture announced it before Harcourt had spoken his rank, was a broad-shouldered man of 50 with a soldier's economy of expression and eyes that moved about the room with habitual attention to detail. Professor Edwin Hargreave, introduced as an historian of some reputation, was a slight, eager-looking fellow in his late 40s who rose from his chair with rather more animation than the occasion appeared to warrant. And finally, Mr. Nathaniel Boyd, Harcourt's personal secretary, who sat somewhat apart from the others and offered a quiet, somewhat diffident greeting. I observed that Holmes took in each face with that brief, absolute attention which I had come to recognise as his method of initial catalogue, and then allowed his gaze to travel without apparent purpose about the room. The arrangement of chairs, the objects upon the mantelpiece, the position of the lamp upon the writing table in the corner. Dinner that evening was a civil enough occasion, though the undercurrent of unease was perceptible to anyone paying attention, and I may say that Holmes was paying considerably more attention than his expression suggested. The conversation touched upon the weather, the history of the manor, and the comparative merits of various routes north, but avoided with a unanimity too consistent to be accidental any reference to the purpose of Harcourt's telegram or the nature of the dossier in his keeping. The snow continued to fall throughout the meal, and by the time we rose from the table, it was apparent to all present that the roads were quite impassable. Sir Julian confirmed as much when he returned from a brief consultation with his coachman. The manor was, for the present, entirely cut off. Holmes received this intelligence with what I alone recognised as the faintest spark of satisfaction. He drew me briefly aside in the corridor before I retired, his voice low and perfectly even. "An interesting gathering, Watson," he murmured, his grey eyes reflecting the candlelight. 7 individuals, each with a reason, declared or otherwise, to be in proximity to that dispatch case. The snow is a complication for most of them, I expect. For one of them, I rather think it is a convenience. "You suspect one of them already?" I asked. "I suspect all of them, which is a more useful beginning." He paused, turning his gaze briefly towards the closed door of Sir Julian's study, beyond which I knew the dispatch case was secured. Forced proximity, my dear Watson, has a curious effect upon respectable company. It has a habit of revealing what comfortable distance usually conceals. With that remark he turned away, and I was left alone in the corridor with the sound of the snow against the window and the particular unease of a man who knows that the night is not yet done with its business. Chapter 2. The Locked Study. I have slept in stranger circumstances than those which greeted me at Blackthorne Manor that January night. Campaign billets in Afghanistan have a way of recalibrating a man's expectations of comfort, but I do not think I have ever found sleep harder to secure than I did in the small hours of that particular morning. The wind pressed steadily against the casement, and the snow, which had not relented since our arrival, produced against the glass a dry whispering that was somehow more insistent than any louder sound. I lay awake for some time, were my thoughts turning uneasily between the faces I'd catalogued at dinner and the question which Holmes had left suspended in the corridor like smoke after a candle is snuffed. I had no means of knowing at what hour I finally slept, but I know precisely what woke me. It was a voice, Harcourt's voice, raised just sufficiently above its usual level to carry through the walls of a house not built for such communications. I dressed with the hurried economy of a former soldier, took my candle, and found the corridor already occupied. Holmes was there before me, which surprised me not at all. He was fully dressed, his dressing gown apparently never having been called upon, and he stood in the doorway of Sir Julian's study with an expression of careful neutrality, observing the scene within. Harcourt stood in the centre of the room, a lamp held high in his left hand, his right pressed flat upon the writing desk as though he required its support. The dispatch case, a square, leather-bound affair of modest dimensions secured with a brass hasp, sat open upon the desk. It was empty. The others arrived in ones and twos over the following several minutes, each in a varying state of undress and alarm. Sir Julian came first, then Captain Radcliffe, who had, I noted, taken the time to pull on his boots, then Mrs. Cartwright in a dark woolen wrapper, Professor Hargreaves still clutching a book he had apparently been reading, and lastly Boyd, pale and silent, fastening his cuffs as he entered. Holmes had by this point moved to one side of the doorway and stood with his back against the panelling, his gaze conducting a quiet and systematic tour of the room. The dossier is gone, Harcourt announced, with the flat precision of a man who has already exhausted his disbelief. I checked the case no more than 2 hours past before I retired. It was present and sealed. Now it is not. The room absorbed this information in various ways. Sir Julian drew himself up with the expression of a man whose house has been insulted. Mrs. Cartwright said nothing, but her eyes moved to Boyd. Captain Radcliffe folded his arms. Professor Hargreave pressed his lips together and set his book down carefully upon the nearest chair, as though the moment called for particular tidiness. Boyd said, "Are we certain it has not been mislaid? Perhaps in the packing?" "The case was locked," Harcourt said. "I am not in the habit of mislaying government documents." "Boyd!" It was at this point that Holmes spoke for the first time, and with the unhurried courtesy that he reserves for occasions when he wishes his words to be received as settled conclusions rather than proposals. "I wonder if I might ask a preliminary question," he said. "Who last had physical possession of the key to the dispatch case?" "I alone possess that key," Harcourt replied. "It has not left my person." "I see." Holmes turned and examined the open case with his lens, bending over it in that angular, intent fashion of his without touching any surface around it. Then he straightened and looked at the door to the study. What he looked at, the rest of us then looked at in turn, as one invariably does. The door was of solid oak, fitted with a good mortice lock. The key to that lock, a large, sound, iron affair, lay in the inside keyhole, where it had evidently been when the door was forced, for the escutcheon plate bore a fresh bright scratch that had not been there before. The single window of the study was set into 18 inches of stone wall, and sealed on all sides by a frost so thick and even that it could not have been disturbed and reformed overnight. I stepped to the glass and examined it myself. There was no break in the crystalline patterning, and the outer sill, visible through the clear centre of the pane, bore an undisturbed cushion of snow several inches deep. The room was locked from within, I observed aloud. And the window inviolate, Holmes agreed mildly. The servants? Sir Julian shook his head. They sleep in the east wing. The connecting passage has been shut since supper. Mrs. Aya Hartley, my housekeeper, keeps the only other key. Then we are presented, Holmes said, addressing the room at large in a tone of academic pleasantness, with a room from which no one entered, in which a document has nonetheless ceased to exist. He allowed a brief pause. This is, I confess, rather more interesting than I anticipated. There followed a quarter hour of what I can only describe as democratic conjecture. Captain Radcliffe proposed that a servant had concealed himself in the room before it was locked. Mrs. Cartwright suggested, with delicate emphasis, that Harcourt might have moved the document himself and forgotten doing so in a state of fatigue. Professor Hargreave offered the theory, advanced with some academic enthusiasm, that the hasp of the case might have been defective and the document simply fallen from it at an earlier point. Boyd said very little and watched the floor. Holmes listened to all of this with his head slightly inclined and his fingers laced behind him, the posture of a man at a lecture whose opinion of the lecturer he has already formed. When the proposals had run their course, he offered no counter-argument. These are all possibilities worthy of consideration, he said pleasantly. I shall require the morning to consider them. The morning? Harcourt said with some agitation. Holmes, that document is not, I think, beyond recovery, Holmes replied, but no useful examination can be made tonight. The light is wrong, and several persons have already moved through this room in ways they will not accurately remember. I would ask that the study be vacated immediately, the door locked and the key surrendered to Mr. Harcourt, and that no one make any communication with any other member of the party upon the substance of what has been discussed here tonight. There was a brief charged silence. You suspect one of us, Radcliffe said. It was not a question. I suspect, Holmes replied equably, that somewhere in this house a series of quite deliberate decisions were made tonight by someone who was confident that snow and a locked door would be sufficient to defeat scrutiny. He retrieved his candle from the hall table. They are, on the whole, correct about the snow. He said nothing further. The company dispersed by mutual unspoken agreement, returning to their rooms with the subdued and slightly indignant air of people whose sleep has been stolen by someone else's misfortune. I walked with Holmes towards our adjoining rooms at the far end of the corridor, and he paused at his door long enough to say, quietly, and as though to himself rather than to me, "When a room admits no intruder, Watson, the intruder is already in the room." He closed the door before I could reply, and I stood alone in the corridor, holding my candle against the dark and listening to the snow. Chapter 3. The Impossible Theft. Holmes was at the study door before 8 o'clock the following morning, which is to say before any other member of the household had descended to breakfast, and while the light from the east was still the thin, grudging illumination of a winter dawn filtering through 2 inches of cloud. I had slept poorly and risen early, drawn as much by habit as by the persistent sensation that the house around me was not at rest. When I found him already in the corridor, his lens in his breast pocket, and his expression composed into that particular alertness which precedes close work, I asked no questions. I simply followed. Harcourt surrendered the key from his waistcoat without ceremony, and Holmes unlocked the study door with the careful deliberation of a man who intends to remember exactly what he finds. He did not enter immediately. He stood in the doorway for a full minute, his gaze moving across the room in a series of unhurried traversals, left to right and then near to far, in the manner of a reader working through a page he wishes to memorize. I waited behind him and said nothing. The study was a modestly furnished room, clearly more functional than decorative in Sir Julian's domestic arrangements. A writing desk occupied the centre, flanked by a leather chair of the old-fashioned barrel variety. Bookshelves lined 2 walls. A fireplace in the far wall held the grey remains of last night's fire, and the iron grate was cold to the touch when I subsequently examined it. A single lamp stood on the desk, its wick trimmed, its reservoir still carrying a good measure of oil. It was this fire that Holmes moved to first. He crouched before the grate in that folded, angular way of his, and studied the ash for some moments without disturbing it. Then he took a pencil from his pocket and gently displaced a small section of the upper surface. Beneath the pale grey layer of older ash lay a stratum of darker material, recently burnt, and Holmes examined it with close attention. The fire was stirred and fed last night, he said, not by a servant. We have established the servant's access was closed, and not, it would appear, by Harcourt, who tells us he did not enter the room before discovering the theft. Yet the fire was attended to by someone, and at some point after the household retired. He rose and moved next to the writing desk. The dispatch case remained where it had been left, still open. Holmes examined the hasp at length, rotating the case slightly to catch the grey morning light across its surface. He then produced his lens and held it over the lock mechanism for nearly 30 seconds. The focused intensity of his posture suggesting that what he saw there was worth considerably more than a passing inspection. "You mentioned last night," I ventured, "that the key showed fresh scratches." "I didn't mention it last night," Holmes replied without looking up. "I noted it. There is a distinction. Premature announcement is the enemy of clear observation." He set the case down. "But yes, the scratches on this lock are not the marks of ordinary use. They're concentrated at the edge of the keyway, the kind of pattern produced when a key is inserted hastily, or when a duplicate of imperfect manufacture is used under pressure of time." This was a significant point, and I said so. "It is one of 3 significant points," Holmes replied. He straightened and turned towards the leather chair at the writing desk. The chair stood perhaps 6 inches to the right of its natural position. That is to say, the position indicated by the indentations in the carpet where its legs had rested repeatedly over a long period of use. Such marks, in a room as infrequently rearranged as this one clearly was, are as reliable a record as a written note. "Someone sat in this chair," I said. "Someone sat in this chair who did not intend to be found sitting in it," Holmes replied. "They replaced it, but not quite accurately. A man performing a habitual action, returning to his desk at the end of his working day, for instance, will replace a move chair precisely, because familiarity guides him. A man performing that action for the first time in haste and in dim light will place it approximately." He surveyed the room once more. "The third point. I'd already seen it, or rather I had seen it when I entered and filed it away without then understanding its significance. Near the base of the study door, at a distance of perhaps 14 inches from the threshold, there lay upon the carpet a small irregular patch of dampness, darker than the surrounding wool. In the cold and the dry interior of the house, it had not fully dried overnight. Holmes crouched over it with his lens. "Melted snow," he said, with entire certainty. "Carried in on a boot. The position is consistent with a man who has just stepped through the door and paused, perhaps to listen, before proceeding further into the room. The quantity suggests a single boot print, not a trail. The rest was shaken or stamped free at the threshold, but this persisted." He looked up at me. "Someone entered this room last night from outside the house." "But the window," I began, "is sealed and undisturbed." "I am aware of that." Holmes rose and dusted his knee. "The window is not the point. The window is what we are supposed to consider." He moved to the door and examined the mortice lock once more, this time from the inside. The keyhole showed that fresh bright scratch I had observed the previous night, a single clean line across the aged brass of the escutcheon, betraying recent contact from a key inserted quickly or under imperfect conditions. By the time Holmes had completed his examination of the room, it was past 9 o'clock, and the smell of breakfast was drifting along the corridor with the impartial democracy of a country house kitchen. We found the company assembled in the dining room with the slightly over-careful civility of people who have been awake half the night contemplating one another's potential guilt. The conversation, such as it was, had the halting quality of an orchestra tuning without a conductor. Harcourt looked haggard. Sir Julian maintained the performance of a competent host, ensuring plates were filled and coffee circulated, but his eyes moved between his guests with a speculation he was not entirely successful in concealing. Mrs. Cartwright ate with composed appetite and offered no opinion on any subject. Radcliffe drank his coffee standing, his back partly to the room, looking out at the snow, which continued to fall with the same tireless application as the night before. Hargreave had brought a small notebook to the table and was consulting it between bites, apparently quite absorbed, though I noticed his consultations became more frequent whenever Holmes was near. Boyd ate nothing and sat with his hands curled around his cup. Holmes consumed a modest plate of eggs and said almost nothing, which in my experience is rarely a sign of inactivity. When the party had finished and the table was being cleared, he rose and addressed the room with the brisk pleasantness of a man announcing a morning walk. "I should like, if there are no objections, to examine the grounds before the snow deepens further," he said. "Watson, will you accompany me?" I said I would, and no one objected, though several faces registered a question they didn't ask. Outside, the cold was a hard and immediate fact. The snow lay a foot deep across the open ground and had drifted to twice that height against the walls and hedges. Holmes moved quickly across the pristine white of the courtyard, his sharp eyes sweeping the unbroken surface until he found what he was looking for, or rather, found what we were clearly meant to find. He stopped and held out a hand to check my progress. Before us, leading from the side of the house towards the tree line some 100 yards distant, ran a single trail of boot prints. Clear, deep, purposeful. The stride of a man moving with decision. Holmes studied them without expression for a long moment. Then he said quite calmly, "We shall need to go no further. You do not wish to follow them?" "The prints," he said, will tell us considerably more from here than they would at closer range." He put his hands into his coat pockets and tilted his head slightly, the posture of a man reading a notice posted at an inconvenient height. "There is something rather the matter with them, Watson. Tell me what you see." I looked. I saw boot prints in the snow, leading away from the house towards the woods. I said so. "Yes," said Holmes, "and what you do not see is what matters entirely. Chapter 4. The Problem of the Snow." There is a particular quality to silence in open country after heavy snowfall that is quite unlike any other silence I know. It is not merely the absence of sound, but the presence of something, a dense, attentive stillness, as though the landscape itself is holding its breath. Standing at the edge of Blackthorne Manor's courtyard that morning, with the grey sky pressing low overhead and the unbroken white stretching away on all sides, I felt that quality acutely. It made Holmes's stillness seem, if anything, more emphatic than usual. He had not moved from the spot where he had stopped me. His gaze remained fixed upon the trail of boot prints, and there was in his expression that quality of suspended animation which I had long since learned to respect, the outward quietude of a mind working at considerable speed behind it. I looked again at the prints and tried, with the diligence of long practice, to see them as he did rather than as I naturally would. They were large prints, made by a heavy boot with a plain sole and a slightly worn heel on the right side. They led away from the house at a consistent stride, in neither hurried nor leisurely, in a straight line towards the stand of bare oaks and ash at the far edge of the grounds. The snow around them was undisturbed. The trail was singular, one man, one direction. And then it stopped. I had seen this from the doorway as we came out, but had assumed Holmes wished to examine the terminus more closely. Now, held back, I understood that the stopping point was not the point at all. "What I do not see," I said slowly, following his earlier prompt. "There are no prints returning." "That is one absence," Holmes said. "There is another." I looked again. The prints led away. There were no prints approaching, no trail from the house to the point where the outward journey began. The track simply commenced, as though the walker had been deposited at that spot by some agency that left no mark of its own. The prints begin already facing away from the house, I said. Holmes turned to me with an expression of mild approbation. Precisely. A man leaving the house would produce a trail from the door to this point, and then onward. What we have instead is a trail that begins here, in the middle of open ground, already oriented towards the trees. There is no approach, there is only departure. He paused. Or rather, there is the performance of departure. I considered this for a moment. The cold was pressing through my overcoat with considerable persistence, but I gave it no attention. You're saying the prints were made deliberately, that someone walked out here, turned their back to the house, and walked away from it, not from the door, but from this spot, specifically to create the impression that a person had left. I am saying, Holmes replied, with the precision that characterizes his best moments, that someone created the impression of an outward journey without creating the evidence of a beginning to that journey, which means they worked backwards. He stepped forward now, moving not towards the trail but alongside it at a distance of several feet, crouching at intervals to examine the snow surface. Note the depth of each print relative to its neighbours. When a man walks normally, his weight is distributed across the stride, deeper at the ball of the foot, lighter at the heel, with a slight variation depending upon pace and gradient. These prints are of uniform depth throughout, front to back, side to side. Which signifies what? Precisely that each was made by a man planting his foot squarely and pressing down rather than transferring his weight through a natural stride. Holmes straightened and surveyed the line of prints with the detached satisfaction of a man who has confirmed what he already knew. Someone stood at each impression and pushed his boot into the snow with deliberate even pressure, walking backward from the tree line to this point and creating prints that face away from the house. The irregularity is subtle, and in any other conditions, if the snow had been less fresh or the light less clean, it might have passed undetected. He turned and looked back at the house. Several of the ground floor windows were visible from where we stood, and I was not certain that the curtains of one of them, the dining room, I thought, had not moved in the interval since we came out. Holmes noted it too, or if he did not, gave no indication either way. Captain Radcliffe, I said. I had been arriving at this conclusion for the past several minutes, and it seemed time to give it voice. He was standing at the window when we left. He had his boots on last night before the rest of us were dressed, and he is the one man here whose military experience would incline him towards this kind of practical misdirection. Your reasoning is sound as far as it goes, Holmes said. He had begun to move back towards the house, and I fell into step beside him. The prints will require confirmation against the sole of a specific boot, and I shall attend to that. But let us be rigorous, Watson. The capacity for misdirection is not uniquely military. It is also the native talent of the habitual deceiver, the practiced liar, and, perhaps most relevantly, the person acting under instruction from someone more experienced in such matters than themselves. You think he was directed by another? I think, Holmes said carefully, that walking backward through a foot of snow in the dark at considerable personal discomfort, and doing it with sufficient precision to produce convincing prints, argues either considerable competence or considerable motivation. A man acts with that kind of discipline when the stakes are high enough. The question worth asking is not who made the prints, but what they were designed to conceal, and for whose benefit the concealment was required. We re-entered the house through the side passage, stamping snow from our boots in the small lobby before passing into the warmth of the corridor. Holmes paused there to remove his coat, and as he did so, Radcliffe appeared at the far end of the passage, coming, it seemed, from the direction of the smoking room rather than the dining room where we had left the party. He stopped when he saw us. For a fraction of a second, something moved across his face. Assessment, I thought, rather than guilt, but rapid and carefully suppressed. Cold work, he said, with the soldier's equanimity and social awkwardness. Instructive, Holmes replied pleasantly. The snow records a great deal, Captain, when one knows how to read it. Radcliffe held his gaze for a moment. And what does it record this morning? At the moment, Holmes said, handing his coat to the hall stand. A question. Ma'am, but questions, in my experience, have a way of resolving themselves into answers given sufficient patience. He smiled, briefly and without warmth. I find I have a great deal of patience today. Radcliffe said nothing further. He inclined his head with the measured courtesy of a man determined to show no weakness, and continued down the passage. I watched him go. Holmes, I said quietly. Yes, he replied, without my needing to complete the thought. Quite so. He looked once more towards the study door at the far end of the hall, then back to me. I shall require this afternoon for the interviews. I would ask you to remain present throughout, Watson, not merely as a record, but as an audience. A man under examination tells you considerably less about what he knows than about what he fears. A second pair of attentive eyes is worth a great deal in such work. You might have more success, I suggested, if the rest of them knew what you found in the snow. On the contrary, Holmes replied, my success depends entirely on their not knowing. He said it with the quiet certainty of a chess player who has seen several moves further than the board presently displays, and with that he turned towards the stairs, leaving me once more in the company of the cold draught from the passage and the faint sound, overhead, of someone pacing the length of their room. Chapter 5. The Interviews. Holmes conducted his examinations that afternoon in the small morning room at the rear of the house, a spare, north-facing chamber that Sir Julian apparently used for correspondence, and which had the considerable practical virtue, from Holmes's point of view, of containing only 2 chairs and very little else to distract either party from the business at hand. He asked Mrs. Hudson, I correct myself, the habit of association is difficult to break, he asked Sir Julian's housekeeper to bring tea at the outset and thereafter leave the household to its own devices. The interviews were to be private, conducted singly, and were to be understood as entirely voluntary. Holmes made this last point with a particular emphasis that renders voluntary participation essentially compulsory in the mind of anyone with anything to conceal. I sat to one side with my notebook, which Holmes had specifically requested I bring, though I observed that his own attention never once strayed to its pages. He had no need of notes. His memory in such matters is as reliable and precisely indexed as any written record, and the notebook's real purpose, I had come to understand over the years, was to give the person under examination somewhere to look other than at Holmes. Sir Julian Blackthorne came first, by virtue of his position as host and his evident desire to demonstrate that the hospitality of Blackthorne Manor extended even to criminal inquiry. He settled into the opposite chair with the practised ease of a man accustomed to sitting on committees and receiving deputations, his broad hands resting on his knees, his florid face arranged into an expression of cooperative authority. He had, he said, spent the entire evening of the theft in the smoking room, first alone and then in the company of Captain Radcliffe, who had joined him at some point after 10 o'clock. He had not visited the study. He had heard nothing unusual. He wished Mr. Holmes every success and offered the full resources of the house. Holmes thanked him with great cordiality and asked, apparently as an afterthought, what he had been smoking. Sir Julian blinked. I beg your pardon. Your preferred cigar, Holmes said pleasantly. I noticed a box of Coronas upon the smoking-room mantelpiece, a good choice for an evening at leisure. I ask only because I am something of a student of tobacco in its various forms, and I observed that the ash upon your cuffs this morning, your left cuff in particular, was of a rather different character, finer, lighter, and with a slight blue-grey tinge that I associate less with cigar than with cigarette. And a cheap variety at that. There was a short silence of the kind that sounds much louder than the surrounding quiet. I occasionally smoke a cigarette, Sir Julian said, with somewhat diminished ease, when I am restless. Of course, Holmes replied, as though the matter were entirely settled. He asked 3 further questions about the layout of the house, thanked Sir Julian for his time, and closed the interview with a warmth that left its subject apparently uncertain whether he had been suspected of anything or not. When the door closed behind him, Holmes made a single brief notation on the small card he kept in his breast pocket, not in my notebook, and said nothing. Mrs. Evelyn Cartwright entered with the self-possession of a woman who has decided in advance that she will not be made uncomfortable, and largely succeeded. She was dressed with quiet precision, her dark hair arranged without fuss, her grey eyes direct without being challenging. She'd retired early, she said. A headache, genuinely debilitating, which had driven her from the after-dinner company before 9:30. She had taken a candle to her room, read for perhaps an hour, and slept. She had heard Harcourt's voice in the corridor and risen when the household was disturbed, as any person would. Holmes expressed sympathy for the headache and inquired with solicitous interest whether she had found the candles in her room satisfactory, as he had found his own somewhat variable in quality. Mrs. Cartwright replied that her candle had burned well enough, thank you. "I am glad to hear it," Holmes said. "I ask because I noticed this morning a small deposit of candle wax on your left sleeve, just at the inner wrist where it would fall if the candle were held at a descending angle whilst in motion, rather than set upon a table. A stationary candle very rarely drips onto its holder's sleeve. A carried one frequently does." Mrs. Cartwright looked at her sleeve with an expression of careful neutrality. "I carried it to bed," she said. "Along the corridor?" "Yes." "And not upon any other errand during the course of the evening?" The pause before her reply was brief, but it was there. "No," she said. "Directly to my room?" Holmes nodded with every appearance of satisfaction, and moved the conversation to a question about whether she had observed any change in Harcourt's demeanour during the days preceding the gathering, a question sufficiently oblique to conclude the interview without resolution, and to leave Mrs. Cartwright as she rose to go with the politely unsettled air of a careful player who is not quite certain what game is being played. Captain Radcliffe submitted to his interview with the upright stillness of a man who has been interrogated before, and considers it a test of character to give nothing away without giving the impression of concealment. He had walked the corridor after midnight. This he offered before Holmes had asked, which was itself instructive, and had subsequently gone outside briefly to check the state of the weather and assess whether any route from the manor might have become passable. He had found it had not, and returned inside. Holmes asked which door he had used. The side passage door, Radcliffe said without hesitation. Holmes asked how long he had been outside. 10 minutes, perhaps a quarter of an hour. Holmes asked whether, during that time, he had walked any distance from the house. Radcliffe said he had not. He had stood in the shelter of the porch and observed the snow. Holmes thanked him, and asked nothing further about the grounds, turning instead to a sequence of questions about Radcliffe's military service and his acquaintance with Harcourt, which Radcliffe answered with increasing confidence, apparently satisfied that the most dangerous ground had been passed. I noted, though I recorded nothing, that Holmes spent the last portion of the interview with his gaze resting with apparently idle interest upon Radcliffe's boots, which were sturdy, well made, and bore on the right heel a pattern of wear entirely consistent with what I had observed in the snow that morning. Professor Hargreave arrived in a state of mild agitation that he attempted, not entirely successfully, to present as intellectual excitement. He admitted at once, and with the slightly aggressive candour of a man hoping to preempt discovery, visited the study on the previous afternoon. He had been fascinated, the word came with a deprecating laugh, by Harcourt's account of his diplomatic work, and had asked Sir Julian's permission to consult a volume on the Balkan treaties which he believed to be amongst the study's books. He had not touched the dispatch case. He had remained perhaps 20 minutes and left before supper. Holmes asked whether he had been alone in the study during those 20 minutes. Hargreave said he had. Holmes asked whether the fire had been burning. Hargreave paused, then confirmed that it had been. Holmes thanked him warmly, and as the professor rose, observed with an air of mild curiosity that the volume on the Balkan treaties to which Hargreave had referred was shelved not in the study but in the library, a fact which Sir Julian had mentioned to him that morning. Hargreave coloured briefly, said he had perhaps misremembered which room he had been directed to, and withdrew. Nathaniel Boyd came last and sat as though the chair were uncomfortable. He was a slight young man of perhaps 28, intelligent about the eyes, but presently hollow with sleeplessness. He had not, he said, left Harcourt's side all evening. He had been in the sitting room, then in the corridor, then in his room. He knew nothing of the dispatch case beyond its existence and its importance. His voice was steady, but his hands, set upon his knees in an echo of Sir Julian's posture, were not. Holmes asked him, gently and with no particular emphasis, how long he had been in Harcourt's employment. 7 months, Boyd said. Holmes asked who had provided his reference. Boyd named a firm of solicitors in the city. Holmes nodded, made no notation, and thanked him for his time with a kindness that appeared, I thought, to relieve Boyd more than it ought to have done. When the last of them had gone, I set down my notebook and looked across at Holmes. He was standing at the window, looking out at the snow which had not ceased. "Well," I said. "I find," Holmes replied without turning, "that I am considerably more interested in what each of them omitted than in what any of them said." He was quiet for a moment. "Movements, Watson. Not one of them gave me an entirely consistent account of their movements, and not one of them gave me an entirely false one. The truth, in this house, has been distributed very carefully, one portion to each person, and none of them holding quite enough of it to be dangerous alone." He turned from the window at last, and there was in his face the focused, contained energy of a man who has gathered sufficient material and is now preparing to work with it. "Tomorrow," he said, "we shall see what the contradictions yield." Chapter 6. What was not said. The second evening at Blackthorne Manor had a quality quite distinct from the first. Where the initial night had carried a tension still partially disguised beneath the forms of social convention, the passed decanter, the exchanged pleasantry, the careful avoidance of the subject uppermost in every mind, this second gathering had shed such pretences almost entirely. The company sat in the drawing-room after dinner, with the strained civility of people who have been compelled by circumstance into a proximity none of them would have chosen, and who are beginning to find it wearing. The fire burned well. Ere the lamps cast their warm light with complete indifference to the atmosphere they illuminated. Outside, the snow continued its patient accumulation. Holmes had spent the afternoon in a manner which, to any observer but myself, would have appeared to consist largely of reading and smoking. He occupied the armchair nearest the drawing-room window, a volume open upon his knee, his pipe going steadily, exchanging occasional remarks with whichever member of the party approached. I knew, from long experience, that this apparent leisure was as purposeful as everything else he did. He was listening, not to conversations so much as to the intervals between them, to what was addressed to whom, and what was conspicuously avoided, to the shifts in the room's social gravity as one person rose or another settled. He was reading the company as attentively as any text, and the book upon his knee was merely a prop to prevent the company from reading him. I was at the writing table, occupied with a letter that I had small expectation of posting before the roads cleared, when Holmes set down his volume and addressed the room. "I wonder," he said, with the conversational ease of a man raising a trivial point at his club, "whether any of you noticed what hour the clock in the study struck last night." The question produced a particular kind of silence. Not the silence of people who didn't hear, but the more charged silence of people who were rapidly calculating their answers. It was Hargreave who replied first. "Midnight," he said, with the comfortable certainty of a man reporting a plain fact. "I heard it quite clearly from my room. The rooms share a wall, as you know." "Midnight," Radcliffe confirmed from his position near the fire. He said it without looking up from the glass he was turning slowly in his hand. I noted it particularly. It was shortly after that I went into the corridor. Mrs. Cartwright, from the sofa where she sat with a piece of needlework that had not visibly advanced since dinner, said that she had heard 12 strokes as she lay reading. Her tone was that of a person supplying a corroborative detail that has not been requested but cannot do harm. Holmes received all 3 confirmations with a mild nod. "Thank you," he said. "That is most helpful." He said nothing further for several minutes, returning with apparent contentment to his book. I, who had been watching him, caught his eye briefly. His expression told me nothing. but the particular set of his mouth told me rather more. After the company had retired, Boyd first, then Hargreave, then the rest by degrees, I remained behind with Holmes, who made no move towards his own room. When the last footstep had receded overhead, he rose and led me without explanation to the study, where he unlocked the door, lit the lamp upon the desk, and directed my attention to the mantelpiece clock. It was a fine bracket clock of the Vienna variety, dark wood with a brass face, and it stood in the centre of the mantelpiece with the settled permanence of an object that has occupied the same position for a long time. Holmes took it down with both hands, carried it to the desk and turned it so that the face was towards us. The hand stood at 11:40. "It stopped during the previous night," I said. "It stopped," Holmes corrected, setting the clock down with care, "at 11:40 and has not been restarted. Whether it stopped naturally, a wound spring, a mechanical failure, or was deliberately arrested, I cannot at this moment determine with certainty. What I can determine is that 3 individuals in this house claim to have heard it strike midnight. The significance was immediate and unambiguous. They lied," I said. "One of 2 possibilities presents itself. Either all 3 independently selected the same plausible time without any collaboration, which is possible but requires a rather generous assessment of coincidence, or the claim of midnight was agreed upon in advance, circulated among those who needed to produce a consistent alibi for the relevant hour, and introduced tonight in response to my question." Holmes settled into the desk chair and crossed his legs. "What is particularly interesting is who did not claim to have heard it. I thought back over the responses. Sir Julian said nothing, nor did Boyd." "Precisely. Sir Julian may have had no reason to establish his movements at midnight, or he may simply be more cautious than the others. Boyd, I suspect, was not told what answer to give, which suggests he's not fully inside whatever arrangement the others have made." Holmes produced the small card from his breast pocket and added something to it in his cramped, economical hand. "But the central fact is this. If the clock stopped at 11:40 and the theft was discovered shortly after midnight, then the theft occurred within a window of 20 minutes, or it occurred before 11:40, before Harcourt made his final check, which Harcourt insists is not the case." "And the melted snow on the carpet," I said, following the thread. "You said it came from boots recently outside. If someone was outside before 11:40, then they were outside at an hour when the snow was by general report still falling heavily, which it was. Sir Julian's coachman confirmed it was at its worst before 11. Holmes rose and moved to the window, standing before it as he had stood before the one in the morning room, looking out at the darkness. "Someone left this house in the worst of the storm, Watson. Not after midnight, as the false trail is designed to suggest. Before it. Considerably before it. To do what?" Holmes was quiet for a moment. "That," he said, "is the question I am not yet prepared to answer, but I will tell you what I believe the purpose of the trail in the snow was not. It was not an attempt to suggest that the thief fled with the dossier. No one, on reflection, could seriously maintain that a man carrying a stolen government document would walk 20 yards into the open and then vanish. The trail is too obvious, too easily found. It was designed to be found." He turned from the window. "It was designed to redirect attention to the grounds and away from something within the house that I was not supposed to notice." "The hollow panel," I said, remembering the outline of the study's fireplace surround, which I had examined only cursorily that morning. "Mind ye," Holmes looked at me with the expression he reserves for moments when I have arrived at a satisfactory conclusion by a route he considers unorthodox. "You have been more attentive than you allow yourself credit for," he said. "I had not connected it until this moment. The connection is sound, regardless of its timing." He locked the study door behind us and pocketed the key. "There are 2 individuals in this house, about whom I have outstanding questions that their interviews did not resolve. Tomorrow I intend to resolve them. In the meantime, I would ask you to consider this." We were in the corridor, the house silent around us. "Harcourt sent for me," Holmes said quietly, "because he knew the dossier was at risk, not because he feared an intruder. He feared someone already present. He knew, or strongly suspected, before the theft occurred that someone in this company had a reason to prevent that document from reaching London. He paused. He has not told me who, and until he does, I am working with half the picture. He said goodnight with the distracted brevity of a man whose thoughts are already several steps ahead of his present company, and left me in the corridor with the lamp and the cold and the particular sensation, familiar from many previous cases, of standing at the edge of a very deep matter and being not quite certain yet how deep it ran. Chapter 7. The Dossier Found. The third morning at Blackthorne Manor brought the first suggestion that the storm might be relenting. The snow had ceased some time before dawn, and when I drew back my curtains at 7 o'clock, the sky above the moorland was the pale, washed white of exhausted weather, still heavy, still low, but no longer actively hostile. The grounds lay buried and silent beneath their accumulated depth, and the single track that Holmes and I had made to the courtyard wall the previous morning was already half filled and softened to a shallow groove. By afternoon, I thought, a determined rider might get through. By the following morning, almost certainly a carriage. I noted this with a particular calculation that would not, in other circumstances, have occupied my mind over breakfast. We had perhaps 24 hours remaining in which the manor's isolation could be depended upon. After that, the ordinary channels of communication would reassert themselves, which meant that whatever conclusions Holmes intended to reach, and whatever actions those conclusions might require, needed to be reached before the world outside came in. Holmes appeared at the breakfast table looking, as he sometimes did after a night of evidently little sleep, sharper rather than more fatigued, the way a blade looks keener for having been worked on. He took coffee and nothing else, exchanged 3 sentences of meteorological small talk with Sir Julian, and then settled into an observation of the room that would have been invisible to anyone not specifically looking for it. The morning passed with the slightly strained purposelessness of a household that has been disrupted and not yet restored. Harcourt sat with official papers at the writing table in the sitting room, a performance of normalcy that convinced no one, least of all himself. Mrs. Cartwright took up a book. Radcliffe disappeared into the billiards room. Boyd, I noticed, found excuses to remain wherever Harcourt was, as though proximity to his employer offered some form of protection. Professor Hargreave was nowhere to be seen for the better part of 2 hours, which Holmes noted without visible reaction. It was shortly before noon that the interruption occurred. I was with Holmes in the morning room, where he had been making his first extended examination of the fireplace around in the study. I should say that he had slipped into the study on some pretext, and had been there for 20 minutes before rejoining me, when we heard footsteps in the corridor, rapid and uneven, and then Hargreave's voice raised to a pitch considerably above his ordinary academic register. "Mr. Holmes! Mr. Holmes! I must ask you to come at once." He appeared in the doorway with the heightened colour and slightly disordered aspect of a man in whom agitation and excitement are conducting a vigorous competition. He was breathing rather quickly, and in his right hand he held, I saw it the moment he entered, a sheaf of papers, folded once, in a dark blue government cover. The dossier. Holmes regarded Hargreave and the document in his hand with an expression of composed attention that gave nothing away. "Professor," he said, "you appear to have made a discovery." "Behind the fireplace," Hargreave said, stepping forward and setting the papers upon the table with a hand that was not entirely steady. In the study, there is a panel in the right-hand section of the surround, a hollow behind it. I had gone in to look for a particular volume, the history of the Northern Estates that Sir Julian mentioned at dinner, and I noticed the panel was not quite flush with its neighbour. I pressed it, and it gave. He paused, gathering himself. The dossier was inside, wrapped in a cloth set well back. Someone hid it there. Holmes looked at the papers without touching them. "You're certain this is the document in question?" "It is marked with the Foreign Office seal. I recognised it from when Harcourt showed it to us on the first evening." Hargreave straightened slightly, the natural composure of the academic beginning to reassert itself over the agitation. I thought it my duty to bring it to you immediately." "Quite right," Holmes said. "I am grateful for your prompt action." He asked Hargreave to remain and sent me to collect the rest of the party, which I did with a speed that produced, in the drawing room 5 minutes later, an assembly that ran the full range from relief to unease. Harcourt moved directly to the table, examined the cover, lifted it, and checked the contents with a rapid, practiced assessment. Something in his shoulders settled as he did so. The document, whatever its precise nature, appeared to be intact. "It is all here," he said. His voice was quieter than usual, the particular quietness of deep relief. "Thank God for that," said Sir Julian, with the sincerity of a man whose house and reputation have been simultaneously restored. Radcliffe said nothing, but I watched him. He stood slightly apart, his arms at his sides, his expression set into the measured impassivity that I had by now come to associate with deliberate concealment rather than natural reserve. He looked at the dossier in Harcourt's hands. He looked at Hargreave. He did not look at Holmes. It was Radcliffe who spoke next, and he spoke with the directness of a man who has decided that the moment has come to commit to a course of action. "Boyd," he said. The name fell into the room's relieved quiet with the precision of a stone dropped into still water. Boyd looked up from across the table. The blood left his face in a manner so complete and rapid that I instinctively took a half-step towards him, the physician's reflex. Boyd had access to the dispatch case, Radcliffe continued, addressing the room rather than its subject, in the manner of a man presenting a considered case rather than an accusation. He is Harcourt's secretary. He would know the contents and the value of the document. He was in and out of the study on any number of pretexts during the day preceding the theft, and he has given, by his own account, no reliable witness to his movements after 10 o'clock. He paused. The hiding place behind the fireplace is in a room he had ample access to. The concealment there suggests a man who took the document and then lost his nerve before he could remove it from the house. The argument was delivered with the clean, forceful logic of a man who has rehearsed it, and it had its intended effect. The room's relief curdled almost immediately into a new and more specific tension. Several faces turned towards Boyd with expressions that ranged from doubt to something uncomfortably close to conviction. The relief of the document's recovery had made the company generous with their belief, and generosity in such moments is easily redirected. Boyd stood very still. When he spoke, his voice was flat with the effort of control. "I did not touch it," he said. "I have not been near that room since the first evening." "Can you prove that?" Radcliffe asked. Not unkindly, which was the most damaging possible tone. Boyd could not, and said so, and the admission settled over the room like a second snowfall. Holmes had not spoken since thanking Hargreave for his prompt action. He stood to one side of the table and had been during the entirety of Radcliffe's address and its aftermath, engaged in a close examination of his own thumbnail, which is a habit of his when he is thinking at considerable speed and wishes to appear not to be thinking at all. He now looked up, but it was not at Boyd, nor at Radcliffe, nor at the document which Harcourt had gathered protectively to himself. He looked at Hargreave. The professor met his gaze with bright, steady interest and smiled. Holmes did not smile back. He looked, for just a moment, at the study door across the hall, and then at the floor, and then at the middle distance, with the particular expression I had seen him wear on half a dozen previous occasions. The expression of a man confirming, in the privacy of his own reasoning, a conclusion he reached some time ago. "How fortunate," Holmes said at last, to no one in particular, that the document should be found today. The remark was offered in a tone of perfect neutrality, and attracted from most of those present no more than a moment's consideration before the business of relief and accusation reclaimed their attention. But Boyd heard something in it, I think, that the others did not, because he looked at Holmes with the sudden, urgent attention of a drowning man who has seen a hand extended in his direction and is not yet certain whether it means to help or to observe. Holmes gave him nothing further. He put his hands in his pockets and turned to the window, and the discussion around him continued without him, and I watched him standing there, still and unreachable as the snow. Chapter 8. The Confession. The There is a particular cruelty in the mechanics of a false accusation that has nothing to do with malice and everything to do with architecture. The charge against Boyd had been constructed with care, not the theatrical care of a man improvising under pressure, but the more considered care of a man who has prepared a structure in advance and is now, with apparent reluctance, assembling it in public. Each element fitted the next. The access, the knowledge, the absence of a witness, the hiding place. Taken together, they formed something that looked very much like a case, and in a room full of people who wanted the matter resolved before the snow melted and the world returned, that resemblance was sufficient. Radcliffe did not press. That was the most practised element of all. Having delivered his argument with the clean economy of a military dispatch, he withdrew from it, folding his hands and assuming an expression of regretful impartiality, as though he had merely articulated what the evidence already said, and was as open as anyone to a persuasive refutation. The posture made disagreement with him feel unreasonable rather than courageous. It is a technique I have seen in courtrooms, though rarely executed with such natural ease. Boyd bore the first hour of it with a rigid, silent dignity that I found, medically speaking, more alarming than distress would have been. He sat apart from the group in the corner of the drawing-room, his hands in his lap, his eyes directed at the middle distance with the fixed blankness of a man enduring something by the application of sheer will. He answered the questions put to him, for several of the company did put questions, Sir Julian chief among them, with the magisterial thoroughness of a man who has sat on enough county benches to know how an examination should proceed, and answered them honestly and without evasion, which in the circumstances was the one quality that weighed most heavily against him. An innocent man, I have observed, is often at a disadvantage precisely because he has nothing to conceal and therefore nothing to manage. He answers directly, which produces no inconsistencies, but also no reassuring complexity. The guilty man, by contrast, produces a narrative, accounting for his movements, explaining his actions, filling in the spaces, and narrative, however constructed, has the paradoxical quality of sounding more considered than plain truth. Holmes remained at the periphery of all this. He had taken up a position near the door, one shoulder against the panelling, and had not spoken since his single remark at the table. He watched Boyd with a steady clinical attention, and he watched the others with the same quality of gaze, but distributed it so evenly across the room that no one could have said with confidence who its real subject was. It was at 2:30, when the light outside had begun its early winter retreat and the lamps had been lit, that Boyd broke. He did not break dramatically. There was no sudden declaration, no theatrical collapse. He simply looked up from the floor at some point during a renewed exchange between Sir Julian and Radcliffe, and said, in a voice from which all expression had been carefully removed, "Very well." The room came to rest. "I took it," Boyd said. He was looking at Harcourt and Harcourt alone. "I took the dossier from the case. I had been approached some weeks before. A man in London. I didn't know him. He knew a great deal about me, about my debts. He said that he required only a brief sight of the document, not even possession of it, merely confirmation of certain contents, which I could relay to him once the document passed through my hands in the course of my duties." He paused, and the pause had the quality of a man examining his own history from a new and very unflattering angle. "I told him I would not, and then the debts became rather more pressing, and I told him I would consider it, and then we came here, and the storm came, and when the opportunity presented itself, I took the case key from Mr. Harcourt's coat while he slept. I made a wax impression of it. I had already arranged for a duplicate to be cut before we left London." He stopped. "I took the document. I sat in the study and read it, or tried to. I understood very little of it. It frightened me. I put it back inside the case. I was going to put it back. I had decided within the hour that I would not go through with it. And then I heard a sound in the corridor, and I panicked, and I hid the document behind the panel, which I had noticed earlier in the day when the plaster cracked and showed the gap." He said all of this looking at Harcourt, and Harcourt listened to it with an expression that was not anger, or not entirely anger, There was something else in it. A species of grief, perhaps, for misplaced trust, which is its own particular wound. Just as... I intended to retrieve it in the morning and replace it, Boyd concluded. I did not do so because by morning Mr. Holmes had arrived and I did not know how to retrieve it without being observed. Radcliffe said, with the measured satisfaction of a man whose account has been confirmed. There it is then. Sir Julian looked at Holmes. I think, Mr. Holmes, that the matter is settled. I shall have Boyd confined to his room until such time as the authorities can be reached. The document has been recovered, the culprit has confessed, and I think we may all draw breath. Holmes said nothing. Mr. Holmes, Sir Julian said, with the slight impatience of a man who considers the proceedings complete. Forgive me, Holmes replied from his position by the door. I was considering something. Considering what precisely? The young man has confessed. Yes, Holmes said. He has. He moved away from the door and into the room, settling into the chair by the writing table, with a deliberateness that suggested he did not intend to be brief. Watson, you have your notebook. It was not a question. I produced it. Holmes crossed one leg over the other and looked at Boyd with an attention that was, I thought, not unkind. Your account is substantially consistent with the physical evidence, he said. The scratches on the lock correspond to a hastily used duplicate. The melted snow on the carpet is consistent with your having been in and out of the study at an hour when the grounds were heavily covered. The misaligned chair is consistent with a man sitting at a desk he had not previously sat at, in the dark or near darkness. And replacing the chair imprecisely, Boyd nodded. And the wax impression. You made it from a key taken from Harcourt's coat. When? The afternoon of our arrival. He had left his coat in the hall. Whilst we were at dinner, Holmes said, as though completing a calculation. Yes, that would account for it. He uncrossed his legs and rested his elbows on his knees. There is one detail in your account that I should like you to clarify. You say you heard a sound in the corridor and panicked. What kind of sound? Boyd hesitated. Footsteps. At what hour? I'm not entirely certain. Shortly before midnight, I believed. Holmes looked at him steadily for 3 seconds. The study clock had stopped at 11:40, he said. You could not have relied upon it for the time. But 3 other members of this household claim to have heard that same stopped clock strike midnight. You did not make that claim. Boyd said nothing. No, Holmes replied, answering his own silence. You did not, because you were actually in the study at that hour, and you knew very well the clock had not struck because you had been sitting beside it for the better part of an hour. You had no reason to claim otherwise. He rose. Which means your confession, Boyd, is substantially true. And substantially true is not the same as wholly sufficient. The room had acquired the quality of attention that follows an unexpected development in a proceeding assumed to be concluded. Radcliffe's expression of impartial satisfaction had not changed, but it had, I thought, very slightly stiffened. Holmes moved to the mantelpiece and stood with his back to the fire, looking out at the company with the relaxed authority of a man who knows exactly what he's about to say and has been waiting for the right moment to say it. Confessions, he remarked, with a measured thoughtfulness that addressed the room and no single individual in it, have a remarkable quality. They explain almost everything. He paused, letting the weight of the almost settle where it would. Almost everything, except, on occasion, the facts. He looked at Boyd once more, briefly, and what passed across his face in that moment I can only describe as a species of reassurance so quiet that the room did not see it. Boyd saw it. His hands, still in his lap, uncurled slightly. I believe, Holmes said, that we shall require one more evening together. The snow has obliged us this far. I shall ask it to oblige us a little further. He turned to Sir Julian. I am not yet finished with this house. Chapter 9. Holmes reconstructs the crime. Holmes was absent from Blackthorne Manor for the first 2 hours of the following morning, and in that absence the house conducted itself with the uncertain restraint of a room in which someone has recently said something that cannot be unsaid. Boyd remained confined to his room, as Sir Julian had directed, attended by one of the indoor servants in the manner of a man under house arrest rather than formal custody. Harcourt sat with the recovered dossier and a brandy he did not touch. Radcliffe read the newspaper with a steadiness that I found more remarkable than agitation would have been. Hargreave was nowhere visible. Holmes returned shortly before 10, bringing with him the cold of the outside air and an expression of settled finality that I recognised as the outward sign of completed reasoning. He said nothing to me beyond a brief instruction to ensure the whole company was assembled in the drawing-room by past the hour. He then went to his room, and when he came down again he was carrying the small card from his breast pocket, which he set upon the mantelpiece when he entered the drawing-room face down and did not refer to again. They were all present, gathered by degrees and with varying degrees of willingness. Sir Julian in the armchair that had come to be understood as his, Harcourt standing by the window with a dossier under his arm, Radcliffe and Hargreave on opposite sides of the room as though by mutual silent agreement, Mrs. Cartwright on the sofa with a composure I had by now come to regard as her particular form of armour. Boyd had been escorted down by the servant and sat nearest the door, pale and contained. Holmes stood before the fire. He did not pace, did not produce notes, did not address any single person before he was ready to address them all. When the room had settled into its own attentive silence, he began. "I am going to describe what occurred in this house over the past 3 days," he said, in the even unhurried tone of a man reading a report he has already filed. "I shall ask for no interruptions, and I shall offer no conclusions before their proper moment. When I am done, those with objections may raise them, and I shall address each one." He paused, not for effect, but with the natural timing of a man who means what he says. The document which Mr. Harcourt was carrying to London is, I understand, sensitive in the particular sense that its contents bear upon negotiations currently in progress between the British government and certain continental parties whose interests are not uniformly aligned with our own. Its value to a foreign agency would not be in its permanent possession, but in a delay to its delivery. Time enough for certain communications to be made, certain positions adjusted, certain advantages secured before the document's conclusions could inform British policy. He looked at Harcourt. "You knew this before you came here. You knew, or had strong reason to suspect, that someone in this gathering had a connection to interest that would benefit from that delay. You did not tell me so when I arrived, which cost us a day." Harcourt's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The plan as actually executed had 2 components, operated by 2 different individuals whose interests overlapped without being identical. Holmes turned slightly, addressing the room at large without yet naming names. The first component was delay. The dossier was to disappear, not permanently, not irrecoverably, but sufficiently to hold it within these walls for at least 24 hours beyond its intended departure. The method employed was as follows. He moved from the fire to the centre of the room, and the company's attention moved with him. Captain Radcliffe left the house on the evening of the theft, before the snow had reached its greatest depth, and while the household believed him to be in the smoking room with Sir Julian. He went out by the side passage door, which he has confirmed to me this morning. His purpose was not to carry anything out or to bring anything in, but to prepare a deception for the following morning. He walked a path to the tree line, turned, and retraced that path walking backward, pressing each footfall with even, deliberate force to produce prints that faced away from the house without the natural variation of a moving stride. He did this in the dark, in considerable cold, over a distance of approximately 40 yards. Holmes paused. The purpose of this false trail was to give me, on the following morning, a satisfying piece of exterior evidence, an apparent escape route, which would draw my attention outward and delay the interior examination. It very nearly succeeded. Radcliffe had not moved. His face had the fixed, the inward quality of a man making no decision yet about what to do next. In the study, Radcliffe had earlier in the evening performed one additional act. He stirred and fed the fire which had been dying in order to destroy a small piece of written material. I cannot establish its precise nature, but the ash was inconsistent with the wood fuel and suggests paper of a quality rather above ordinary letter stock. He sat in the desk chair and used it as a writing surface. He replaced the chair imprecisely. He then locked the study door from the outside using a skeleton key, not the key to the dispatch case, which he never touched, but the key to the room itself. And this produced the scratch on the escutcheon that I noted on the first morning. "You cannot prove any of this," Radcliffe said. His voice was steady and his face was now quite composed, the composure of a man who has arrived at his decision. "I can prove the prints," Holmes replied, without particular heat. "The stride pattern and foot pressure are reproducible against the cast impressions I made yesterday morning while the household believed me to be walking the grounds for a second time. I can prove your boots match those impressions in every dimension, including the worn right heel, which is distinctive. I can demonstrate that the fire ash in the study contains partially burned paper, which I have preserved. And I have the testimony of Sir Julian's coachman, who observed a figure moving in the grounds at approximately 11 o'clock on the night in question. He did not come forward because he did not consider it his business, and because the figure he saw was known to him." Holmes looked at Sir Julian. "He has since reconsidered." Sir Julian's florid complexion had passed through several gradations. He was now quite pale. "The second component of the plan," Holmes continued, turning to Hargreave, "was rather less disciplined, because it was not part of the plan at all. It was opportunism." Hargreave said nothing. The bright, eager quality had left his expression entirely, replaced by something watchful and careful. "You visited the study on the afternoon before the theft and had noticed the hollow panel during your genuine, if unauthorized, examination of the room's contents. You are a historian, Professor. The concealed spaces of old houses are precisely in your field of interest. When, on the following morning, you observed that the house was occupied with the discovery of the theft and that I was engaged with the exterior grounds, you returned to the study, located the dispatch case which Boyd had not yet replaced, and looked for a better hiding place, not to assist Radcliffe's plan, with which you had no connection, but to preserve the document for your own use, a government dossier on continental negotiations, in the hands of a historian with the right contacts, not to sell, perhaps, but to leverage." He paused. "You moved the document from the case to the panel. You then waited. When sufficient time had passed and the household's suspicion had had opportunity to settle upon the most convenient available candidate, you produced the document with a great show of accidental discovery, made trusting that its recovery would satisfy everyone too thoroughly for close questioning." Hargreaves' small notebook was still in his coat pocket. He pressed one hand against it briefly, as though confirming its presence. The gesture told its own story. "Boyd's confession," Holmes said, returning his gaze to the company as a whole, "is true in its essential facts. He took the document from the case using a duplicate key made in London. He read it, regretted it, and hid it behind the panel in a moment of panic. What he did not know was that Hargreave had subsequently moved it. Boyd spent 3 days believing he had hidden the document in a place he could retrieve it from, not knowing that it had already been taken from that place by a second pair of hands." The room was entirely silent. Holmes looked at Boyd. "You did not steal the dossier for a foreign power. You took it in a moment of serious misjudgment driven by financial desperation and abandoned the intention within the hour. You replaced the document as best you were able. The rest of what happened to it was not your doing." He turned to Harcourt. "Boyd requires, I think, the opportunity to make full disclosure to the appropriate authorities, under circumstances rather less prejudicial than these. That is a matter for your department, not mine." Harcourt was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded once with the slow, considered movement of a man who has been given an outcome he did not expect and is determining whether to be grateful for it. "The snow," Holmes observed, glancing to the window where the morning light had taken on the sharper quality of a sky beginning to clear, "appears to have made its own decision about duration." He retrieved his small card from the mantelpiece, did not read it, and put it in his pocket. "Radcliffe," he said, "I should remain in this room if I were you. I've taken the liberty of dispatching a message by means of Sir Julian's fastest horse and his most determined groom at 6 o'clock this morning. I rather think we shall have company from the direction of the county constabulary before the afternoon is much advanced. Chapter 10. The Lesson of the Storm. The constabulary arrived at Blackthorne Manor at 2:30 in the afternoon, by which hour the sky had cleared sufficiently to reveal, for the first time in 3 days, something that resembled actual winter sunlight, pale and thin, offering more illumination than warmth, but welcome none the less in the way that any plain fact is welcome after a prolonged period of uncertainty. Inspector Graves of the North Riding Constabulary was a compact, methodical man of middle age, whose first act upon entering the hall was to remove his hat and his gloves with equal deliberation, as though establishing by this unhurried ceremony that he intended to be thorough. Holmes met him in the entrance hall and spoke with him briefly and privately before the formal proceedings began. I do not know precisely what passed between them, but when Graves entered the drawing-room, his manner towards Holmes was that of a man who has received clear instructions from a source he has decided to trust, which is perhaps the most useful relationship Holmes can establish with an official representative of the law. Radcliffe was taken into custody without incident. I had half expected resistance, not violence, but the soldier's instinct to dispute ground rather than yield it, yet he went with a composure that was, in its own way, more unsettling than protest would have been. He paused only once at the drawing-room door and turned briefly towards Holmes. "The foreign contact," he said, with the flat precision of a man closing an account. "I acted under instruction. I was given to understand the delay would be sufficient, that no lasting harm would be done." "Harm," Holmes replied quietly, "is not always visible at the moment of its commission. That is rather the point of it." Radcliffe held his gaze for a moment, then nodded once. Not in agreement, I thought, but in the acknowledgement of a man who has heard something accurate, and left the room between two constables with the step of a man who has accepted his situation and will offer the authorities his full, considered cooperation, which I suspect was the most dangerous thing about him. Hargreaves' arrest was of a different character entirely. He had managed, in the interval between Holmes's reconstruction and the constabulary's arrival, to recover a considerable portion of his academic composure, and he submitted to custody with a series of objections of steadily decreasing force, the impropriety of the charge, the inadequacy of the evidence, the distinction between academic curiosity and criminal intent, each delivered in the reasonable, slightly injured tone of a man who believes that articulate protest ought to constitute a defence. Holmes listened to none of it, having evidently said everything he intended to say on the matter, and Inspector Graves was not a man given to being instructed in the niceties of criminal law by its practitioners. When both men had gone, the house exhaled. It is the only word that sufficiently describes the change in the atmosphere, a general collective release of something that had been held under pressure for 3 days, which left the remaining occupants looking slightly diminished, as people sometimes do when the circumstances demanding their full alertness have been removed. Sir Julian accepted a brandy from his housekeeper and sat in his armchair with the aspect of a man taking stock of what his hospitality had produced. Mrs. Cartwright, who had throughout the entire proceedings maintained a self-possession that I had ceased to find remarkable only because it had been so consistent, finally permitted herself to look tired. She accepted tea and sat with it quietly, contributing nothing further to a conversation that had largely concluded itself. Boyd was released from his confinement. He came downstairs looking as though he had not slept in 3 days, which was accurate, and stood in the doorway of the drawing-room with the particular uncertainty of a man who has been absolved of one charge and not yet fully absorbed the fact. Harcourt crossed the room to him, and what passed between them was conducted in voices too low for anyone else to hear, but the outcome of it appeared, from Harcourt's expression, and from the way Boyd's shoulders eventually descended from their position somewhere near his ears, to be, if not forgiveness, then at least the beginning of a reasonable understanding. There would be official processes to navigate and a formal account to give. Holmes had made that plain, but Boyd would give that account as a cooperative witness rather than as a prisoner, and the distinction in the eyes of the law and of a young man's future is not a small one. It was Holmes himself who requested Harcourt's ear for a quarter of an hour before the courier departed, and I was present for that conversation at Holmes's specific invitation. We sat in the morning room, the three of us, with the thin afternoon sunlight making its best effort through the north-facing window. "You suspected Radcliffe before we came here," Holmes said. It was not an accusation, but it was not an absolution either. Harcourt was silent for a moment. I suspected that someone with access to our itinerary had passed information to a foreign party. Radcliffe was one of 3 possible sources. I did not know which. "And you considered it wiser to say nothing to me and observe?" "I considered," Harcourt said carefully, "that naming an innocent man on the basis of suspicion alone would be a graver error than caution." Holmes looked at him for a long moment. "There is some merit in that position," he said at last, "and I shall give you credit for it. I shall also observe that, had you shared your suspicion on the evening of our arrival, Boyd's 3 days of misery, and the associated complications introduced by Hargreave, might have been considerably abbreviated." He paused. Information withheld in the name of caution has a way of becoming, in effect, information withheld. The consequences are not always distinguishable. Harcourt said nothing, but he received it in the spirit it was intended, which was, I believe, as a professional correction from one serious man to another, delivered without malice and expected to be retained. Holmes and I departed Blackthorne Manor at 4 o'clock, once the roads had been confirmed passable by a returning constable. A trap had been arranged, and as we came out through the front door into the cold, clean air of the cleared afternoon, I looked back at the house and found that in the mellowing winter light it looked considerably less forbidding than it had on our arrival, a substantial, somewhat shabby old house, blinking uncertainly in the unexpected sun, as though surprised to find itself the scene of such events. The drive to the station was largely quiet, Holmes in one corner with his coat up and his chin down, looking out at the landscape through which we had come 3 days before. The moorland was transformed by its covering of the white, the stone walls buried to their capstones, the bare trees holding their loads of snow with a botanical patience that I found, in my then reflective mood, rather admirable. The single track of our trap was the only disturbance in the long white miles between the manor and the village. I had been composing my own account of the affair in my head for the better part of the journey, turning it over and examining it the way one examines a stone found in unusual surroundings, trying to determine what quality of it is most worth recording. I said as much to Holmes. "What strikes you most particularly?" he asked without turning from the window. I considered it. That the crime seemed, at every stage, to be something other than what it was. The locked room was not a locked room problem. The escape was not an escape. The confession was not a complete confession. The recovery of the document was not a resolution. I paused. Everyone in that house trusted what they believed had happened rather than what could actually be observed. Holmes turned from the window at this, and looked at me with the particular attention he reserves for moments he considers worth preserving. "That is very well put, Watson," he said. "You will use it." It was not a question, and he was correct. I have used it here as the nearest thing to a summary that this case admits of. The affair of Blackthorne Manor was not, in the technical sense, among the most complex of problems Holmes was asked to address during our long association. The mechanism, once stripped of its false trails, was not elaborate. What made it instructive was precisely what made it dangerous: the willingness of intelligent people, under the pressure of circumstance, to allow the architecture of an event to substitute for its substance, to accept what appeared to be true in place of what the evidence actually supported. As we boarded the London Express and Holmes accepted tea from the refreshment trolley, with the mild satisfaction of a man returning from an assignment adequately concluded, I set my notebook on my knee and wrote, in the margin of the previous day's notes, the words that Holmes had spoken in that drawing-room, the words with which I find I must close this account, because they carry the weight of everything that Blackthorne Manor, The snow, the false prints, the stopped clock, and the Withheld dossier had together demonstrated. The gravest errors, Watson, arise not from what we fail to see, but from what we assume must be true. I have recorded the case under the title which occurred to me on the journey home, and which I have seen no reason since to alter. I call it The Secret of the Withheld Dossier, though I have sometimes thought, in the years that have passed since that January, that the more accurate title might have been The Secret of the Withheld Truth, which is, after all, the ground from which every deception of any kind must ultimately grow.